do a land acknowledgement. And so Iowa State University is located on the ancestral lands and territory of the Wacoshe or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained the land from the Meskwaki and Sauk nations in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the 17,000 Native people who live in Iowa today. We also want to give a thank you to the Richard Thompson Memorial Fund for sponsoring this event. This particular fund, the Richard Thompson Memorial Fund, is specifically geared towards helping bring lectures around Indigenous peoples to campus as one of its things. So we're thankful for that. As you listen to the presentation, we encourage you to think about how students, staff, and faculty at Iowa State can show up for our Native peoples at this institution and in this state, right? And how we can find ourselves in alignment and next with folks in the spaces that are fit for us to be so, right? But so we can get into the goodness of what today is about, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. So first, we have Bobby Lee is an assistant professor of history at University of Cambridge in the UK. His focus is on Indigenous dispossession in the United States and U.S. state formation in the 19th century American West. He received his PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in American Studies from the University of Heidelberg, and a BA in history and economics from Columbia University. Bobby Lee was a junior fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows before teaching at Cambridge. So thank you for being here with us at 8 o'clock your time, appreciate it. And then we have Tristan Ahtone, who is a member of the Kiowa tribe and is editor-at-large at Grist. He previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at Highway Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, National Native News, NPR, and National Geographic. Ahtone's stories have won multiple honors, including investigative awards from the Gannett Foundation and Public Radio News Directors Incorporated. He additionally led the High Country News team that received a George Polk Award, an IRE Award, a Sigma Award, a Society of News Design Award, and a National Magazine Award nomination. Past president of the Native American Journalists Association. Tristan Ahtone is the 2017 Neiman Fellow and a director of the Muckrock Foundation. If you could help us in the chat and with the reactions and things, help give a warm Iowa State welcome to our guest. And with that, I will pass it over to you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to talk about this work. It's an honor to be speaking today, and really appreciate your interest. So my partner, Dr. Lee, and I are going to give you an overview of the story, as well as some of the practical uses of the platforms that we've built around the investigation. Reminder, if you like, we tend to use the hashtag #LandGrabU, the letter U, to sort of help aggregate stories, thoughts, and hot takes on the topic, see what you all are talking about. And we encourage you to use it if you're using social media, if you feel up to it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And hopefully y'all can see that just fine. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Moral Act here and how to use the data that we collected, and look at the institutions that have been a part of the Moral Act. And to start, just so for y'all's background, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Moral Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the story that we've been told around the Moral Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But as our investigation at High Country News reveals, the Moral Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the Act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land for more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. But one of the things that makes researching and reporting on this hard is that The Morrill Act footprint is broken up into nearly 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 states. And through our 2-year investigation, we were able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels to better understand the relationship between higher education and violent colonialism. Combined, those 80,000 scattered parcels represent an area roughly the size of Denmark. And our reporting really provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. It does also offer an opportunity for additional reporting, research, and collaboration to further the investigative work that the project has kicked off. And we'll discuss that in more detail in just a moment. But first, I'll turn the mic over to Dr. Lee to talk more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
Thanks so much, Tristan, and thanks to all of you for having us. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk with you virtually, at least, about this investigation, land grab universities. Tristan, could we roll on to the next slide? So what I'd like to do here is to give you some background on the project and provide additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach to investigating it. The indigenous sources of university land has been a major emerging issue, really only in the last 5 years or so. And the springboard for this type of work, looking at the relationship between land-grant universities and the indigenous land that funded their endowments, really grew out of studies of slavery in the university that I'm sure many of you have seen. This has been a sort of a building area of research maybe for the last 20 years or so. And it's really only in the last 5 or 6 years that it's turned seriously towards questions about the role of indigenous dispossession in the building and the funding of land-grant universities. You can see hints of this in the work of scholars like Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, whose 2014 book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, flagged this issue of land-grant universities. You can see it in the work of cultural theorists like Kay Wayne Yang, who discusses it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. There's been some specific work on land-grant universities within the framework of settler colonial studies. Important articles by Sharon Stein, who we talk about in the High Country News Story, or who we interviewed for the High Country News Story, and Margaret Nash. And they have framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers. And they really started to unpack how this worked. Meanwhile, we also saw a few researchers at places like UMass and Virginia Tech. They tried to map some of the Morrill Act footprint of individual schools and to connect them to indigenous nations, but they had hit some snags in their approach, and neither of those efforts were really complete. If we go to the next slide here, Tristan, there were also notably schools like the University of Nebraska, Michigan State, and Iowa State University that began mapping their Morrill Act parcels. But Iowa State, like University of Nebraska, like Michigan State, when they started doing this, Iowa State's Project Land Grant Legacy, it looked like it launched circa 2016. This is when some of the material on there was posted. They were looking at the legacy of land grant universities through a conventional lens as gifts of free land that enabled the prosperity of land grant universities. You won't see any efforts to connect or incorporate the history of indigenous dispossession into some of these early works. But what I do think you see are opportunities to combine what we have done and what a project like Iowa State's Land Grant Legacy has done to push this research forward in new and fruitful directions. If you look at the next slide here, you can see some of the mapping project that they had put together using ArcGIS interface. These are some of the parcels in northwest Iowa. They collected. I don't know how complete the extent of the collection of parcels is, but there's really some interesting material looking not on the indigenous side of this history, but on the settler side to track who purchased these land parcels and who they belong to today. I really think there's some important information here that could be really usefully combined with the type of work that we have done. But all of this is by way of saying is that it's only in the last few years that it became a really exciting time to be able to start thinking about what was until really recently an entirely neglected issue in both the scholarship on land-grant universities and the public memory at land-grant universities, the sort of stories that land-grant universities told themselves about themselves. And that is where the High Country News collaboration entered into this burgeoning field. We launched this project in 2018 when Tristan and I were on fellowships at the same university. And it was fortunate, right? Because I'm a historian, he's a journalist. We'd otherwise be running in separate circles. We can go on to the next slide, Tristan. And so the project's goal, the Land Grab University's project's goal was to try to unspool the Morrill Act not completely. We didn't just want to identify the parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state, but to locate them all insofar as that was possible and to track down the indigenous origins of every one of those parcels. And what we were trying to do was to gain a sense of the enormity, really the big picture of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. And that's really the key theme here, thinking about the Morrill Act not as a donation, but as a wealth transfer, not as a donation from the federal government, a wealth transfer from indigenous nations to land-grant universities. And this map that you're looking at here is the result of that investigation in its most condensed form. This is the work of Margaret Peters, the cartographer for the project. She made all of the maps and graphics that you see in the article. But before I'll get into what you're looking at on this map and what it contains, let me just give you a very sort of quick sketch of the Morrill Act itself. So land grants for colleges begins long before the Morrill Act of 1862. In the United States, you have certain state colleges that are getting federal land through sort of one-off pieces of legislation. One of the earliest under the federal government of the United States was Jefferson College in Mississippi, which got a grant of Choctaw land. In 1803, Jefferson College doesn't exist anymore, but it was the alma mater of Jefferson Davis, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. There were schools like Michigan State University, Penn State University, founded as land-grant universities before the Morrill Act of 1862. There were also colonial era universities that received land from colonial governments. This had been a practice. But what happens in 1862 in Lincoln's first term is the nationalization of this form of funding and its explosion into into involving really just unprecedented amounts of land, 11 million acres ultimately under the Morrill Act of 1862. And the way that historians have talked about this and the way that this has been memorialized in public memory is that land-grant universities are democracy's colleges. A lot of the literature on land-grant universities looks into this idea and asks to what extent land-grant universities fulfilled this mission of democratizing education in the United States, of spreading opportunity to poor farmhands, and the sort of agricultural and mechanical industrial classes of workers. The Morrill Act of 1862 doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs at sort of in a moment when you have multiple pieces of land redistribution Indigenous land redistribution legislation, really the sort of big three of 19th century land laws, all in 1862 within a few months of each other. The Homestead Act of 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, and of course the Morrill Act of 1862. They're all engaging in similar practices, and the Morrill Act is going to produce this national system of land grant universities. It gives away what amounts to 10.8 million acres to 47 states, which are going to sell this land, they're going to lease this land, and they're going to funnel the proceeds to build up the endowments of ultimately 52 universities. There are a couple of states, most states support one university with this land grant. There are a couple of states that support two. Most of these universities are public, like Iowa State. Some are private, like MIT, like Cornell. And these grants involve the land of nearly 250 tribes and nations whose territory was claimed by the United States through 162 different treaties. Most of these are ratified. Many of them are unratified, outright land seizures. And when you look at how much was paid in order to extinguish Indian title, which was the way that it was put in the 19th century, roughly $400,000 was paid through these treaties and agreements, pennies on the acre. And from this land, this very valuable land at the time in the 19th century, nearly $23 million is raised. So that's a ratio of about, for every $1 the United States spends to legally extinguish Indigenous title, it's able to pour $57 into the coffers of land grant universities. In contemporary dollars, we're talking about endowment principal worth about $500 million in today's money. And what you saw on that map a minute ago was this nearly 80,000 parcels spread across 24 states that are being redistributed through that act, and sort of the means to compare it, looking at the locations of the land, the locations of the indigenous cessions, and being able to pinpoint which land came from which nations and went to which universities. And what you see here is another infographic, as you're not intended to read the details, but sort of explains how the Morrill Act works. What happens is that Congress offers the land. That's the first step. Some of this land has already been acquired from indigenous nations. Some is going to be acquired in the future. Point 3 here explains the sizes of the grants. These ranged anywhere from 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres. The largest going to the state of New York because it is the largest population in the 1860 census. These were apportioned by congressional delegation size, which is a proxy for a rough proxy for population. The parcels range in size ultimately from a few acres to more than 800 acres. And this point 4 here, I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. There is a big distinction between how Eastern states and how Western states participate in this grant program. And finally, the last step here is the disposal, the sale. Most of this land, or the right to this land, which was distributed through scrip, which were these coupons to select land in the public domain, most of it was offloaded to speculators, so it could be quickly used to raise funds that could be put to work for the universities right away. Because of the way that the Morrill Act was structured, the universities could really only live off the interest, not off the principal that was raised. So there was a strong incentive to try and raise money as quickly as possible, to try and convert the land as quickly as possible into endowments. If you look at the next slide here, you'll see that East-West distinction. Eastern states, really states that didn't have significant amounts of public domain land that had been taken from indigenous nations and was being sold off by the federal government, they were given this scrip to select land anywhere on the surveyed public domain. So this is the case with Cornell University, and this is why the scrip selections ultimately made with that scrip are scattered all over the public domain of the United States, but concentrated in places like Wisconsin and California. On the left here, you see the University of California, Western states with significant amounts of public land. They were so-called land states. Iowa State was a land state. And what this meant was that you had to select the parcels directly within the boundaries of your state. And so this is why you'll see all of Iowa's, when you look at landgrabu.org, see all of Iowa's parcels are within the state of Iowa. They were a land state, and most of the land that was selected for it is in northwest Iowa. Excuse me. If we go to the next slide here, you can see the sort of scales at which you can look at this data that we've collected. Another one of Margaret's graphics here, and you can see the accuracy of the location of these parcels of land. Here's a square mile in the city of Tucson, Arizona, seized from the Apache in the 1880s and redistributed for the benefit of the University of Arizona. Zoomed in a little bit with a satellite image, you can see, football fields, baseball fields, tract housing, highway running through it. There's fast food places, all sort of manner of everyday communities in the United States are embedded on these parcels today. And on the right here, you see the work of Kalen Goodluck, the photographer for the project. He went to many of these parcels in order to get us on the ground and to see what was there today. And this is one of his photographs from within this parcel in Tucson. You see the Apache Tears Motel here. And what our approach, our GIS approach to identify these parcels and identify the Indigenous nations and the land-grant universities, it allows us to tell stories that are normally told separately together for the first time. So in the article, we can reconnect the history of the Dakota War of 1862, the Dakota Session of 1851, to the development of the University of Minnesota and its grant. We can look at how Ivy League universities like Brown and Yale University participated in this process. We can examine places like California, where 1.7 million acres of land seized without any payment at all during the California genocide was used to raise funds for 32 land-grant universities. And we can also see Iowa State's footprint here if we go to the next slide. The data that we collected allows us to look closely at every Moral Act beneficiary, including Iowa State here. Iowa was the first state to accept a Moral Act grant. They did so within a couple of months of its passage in 1862. Selections for its grant amounted to roughly 204,000 acres, and we were able to locate 202,000 of those acres, so 99.4%, nearly the entirety, the full footprint of Iowa State's involvement in this land grant. This land was land that was selected from Indigenous sessions made by the Iowa, made by the Sauk, the Meskwaki, the Wahpeton and Sisseton Sioux, the Yankton Sioux. These sessions took place between the 1830s and the 1850s. The most recent one was in 1858, just 4 years before Iowa State gets its grant. And the U.S. paid to extinguish Indian title about $5,000 for the land that the University Iowa State benefited from. And it benefited to the tune of $686,000. Raised through a leasing and mortgage program in the late 19th century. So that's about $141 of endowment raised for every dollar paid for Indigenous title. That's a sort of one measure of the sort of unequal balance of U.S. colonialism being exerted to extract value and relocate it to the university. In today's dollars, that would be about $18 million in principal at a time when Iowa State was miniature, was really minuscule. And these are the types of things, the stories that you can start to tell. But I'm going to pass it back to Tristan, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about the kinds of images that you're seeing here, the website that we built for this project.
Yeah, so one of the things that we really wanted to do when we took on this project was make sure that the data that was collected was available to anybody who wanted to do any sort of additional reporting or research, or to even fact check our findings. So if you're not comfortable using spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we really wanted to make sure that you could still have access to this information in a clear and user-friendly way, outside of the sort of curated version that we put together for High Country News in the feature story. So on landgrabu.org, which you see here, you have access to all of the same data that we use with the same level of accuracy, and you can explore all of it through interactive maps and web pages. So for instance, here with Iowa State, you'll see a university statement. You'll be able to see founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received. You can adjust for inflation with that switch up at the top to see original value, or what stuff looks like in today's dollars. You can play with a map that we put together, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But you'll also be able to see on the website the tribes that are impacted by Iowa State here, where that tribal land is coming from. You're able to see, as you continue to scroll down, what counties that land is in also, and the dollars raised off of it. And then, of course, the map in which you saw just a moment ago. Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site. And these maps allow you to see the connections between the institution and the land. So you can zoom in, you can get really detailed, you can look at click links for Indigenous land cessions, current state boundaries. You can locate yourself on the map if you like. Those crosshairs on the side there allow the website to locate you and find out if you live next to one of these parcels, or even if you live on one of those, which our developer Jeff McGee found out during the reporting process at his home in Seattle. You'll also see that there's a box there to check addresses. So that search function there at the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel, or even what land cession it's in, so there's really a ton of information here to play with, and allows you to explore and really construct your own sort of narrative. Again, everything here is more or less clickable. So you're able to look at those land cessions and their boundaries, what tribes are involved. Really, there's especially with land cessions, there's really an invaluable number of uses outside of this project that you can do when playing with this. So you can spend a ton of time here exploring this. This is sort of the surface level here, but when you take a look at something like University of California, you can see all the connections like you saw earlier, from the university to Morrill Act lands. But one of the things that I think is most important about this is what you can do for each one of these parcels is click on them and go to a page just for that parcel. So essentially what like Cody and Jeff have done is create 80,000 plus web pages, an individual one for each one of these land parcels, so that you can go and get an incredible amount of detail and information, acre by acre, state by state, and university by university. So, when you zoom into this parcel here in California, you can click on the parcel and go to the parcel page. And what you can see here are treaty co-signers, when it was acquired by the US, the gains associated with it. Just with this page, you can start to really construct a story about this very specific piece of land. And because the site also works on mobile, you can actually go there by locating yourself on your phone and go to that actual parcel, which again is what our photographer Kaylin Goodluck was doing, and is how we know that this parcel that you're looking at here, which looks like a lot of just basic raw data and information, is actually the Directors Guild of America. So it's built on a Morrill Act parcel. So you can actually more or less put a face to a name on some level. It's really how we know that this parcel, also one in Los Angeles, is a residential area. We know that the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington, which was also once Duwamish and Suquamish land, went to Clemson University in South Carolina State after those tribes signed a treaty in 1855. It's also important to note, even when starting to dig deeper, is that while the Suquamish are federally recognized tribe, the Duwamish are still unrecognized and continue to advocate for their rights guaranteed under federal law despite signing a treaty with the federal government. Also, this land you're seeing here was sold for about $4, and the university's raised about $58 from its sale. These cornfields here that you saw earlier, they were acquired from the Kansas tribe for about $24.32 and sold by Ohio State for $1,784.31. And then this land here in El Rosa, Minnesota, was taken from the Dakota and sold by the University of Minnesota for nearly $1,000. And you can see sort of the state that the land is in now. It's just sort of a scrapyard. So these are just a few of Kalen's photos, and I find them to be really haunting and telling about how the land is used today. And we were only able to snap a couple of dozen of these, but again, using the app, should you want to, you can go and do the same, and I encourage you to do so, to visit a parcel, see what's there, and really think about that history and what that inspires in you. One of the other things that we have done in terms of our reporting is that we reported shortly after the story came out in a follow-up that at least 16 land-grant universities, which are nearly about a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres of Morrill Act parcels that were originally assigned to them, that brought in approximately $8.7 million in revenue in fiscal year 2019 alone. Utah State makes for a good example. The school collected more than $1 million in fiscal year 19 from a remaining 28,000 surface acres that they retained from the Morrill Act, as well as 52,000 mineral acres that they also obtained through the Morrill Act. I say that there's more work to be done here too, because we were only able to collect data on fiscal year 19 right before this story came out. So the cumulative revenue from acquisition of these lands to present at these institutions is completely unknown and open for reporting and research. And again, this data and all of the story's data is available for you to download on GitHub. And Dr. Lee will explain just how to do that.
Yeah, this is an open source project. It was always designed to be an open source project. We wanted to both show transparency in our work. I mean, as a historian, the data is our citations, but it was also important to make it possible for others to use all of the data that we have collected, so further researchers wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of amassing all of this information, and could really build upon it. So when you think about the Land Grab Universities project as a whole, what we are providing is really sort of 3 levels of curation. There is the magazine story and High Country News, which is our take on the investigation, a guide through how the Morrill Act works and how it touched down at a number of points that connect universities to Indigenous nations. On the website, it's more of a choose your own adventure approach, where we provide all of the information to and the ability to explore in a semi-guided way to allow users to sort of go through the website and find all of the material that we weren't able to highlight in the story. You know, if this was a story where we gave one page to each one of these universities, it would be 52 pages. If we gave one page to each one of the Indigenous nations involved, it would be 250 pages. We could cover so little. And there's so much more left to be done. So the website enables you to start to see what's there. And finally, the third level, the least curated, although it's still importantly, it's a database that's been designed to provide you full access to the data so you can map it yourself, make additions to it, mix and match it in any ways that you want, republish it, take out material, look closely, look from afar. And this is where you can get it. It's linked on the website. It's a GitHub page. You just click there and you can download this, have it on your own desktop in 5 minutes here. This is just what the GitHub page looks like. If we go to the next page, I know it can be sometimes intimidating if you're not used to working with large or medium-sized data sets. So there is a user's guide that explains in plain English what all of the pieces of information in these files are. This is a combination of two types of files. There are spatial files that describe the parcels and can be mapped with desktop software. And then there's attribute files, which are CSVs, which are basically spreadsheets. You can open them in Excel. So it's possible to work with this data, even if you don't do the spatial side of it, to look at all the attribute data and to start crunching numbers and seeing what you can find and see what we missed. If you go to the next slide, you can see what this looks like. You can see what this looks like on our on a desktop here. I mean, it's just a big spreadsheet with 80,000 rows of data, and there's even a lot more information in the database than is in the story or on the website. All the sources are here. Links are here to take you to original documents. I'd really encourage you all to explore it in different contexts with students or through various research projects. And some others have started to look at this material, and I'll give it back to Tristan and let him tell you a little bit about what's happened since we published this story.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, and it looks like there are questions. I haven't read, I just see the chat icon flashing here, so I want to make sure that we get to those. But you know, the investigation has really started a public conversation around the idea of what debts universities owe to Indigenous communities. And there have been three areas that we've seen at least reporters sort of play in when it comes to taking on this story, which are more or less localizing, contextualizing, or adapting the data. So for instance, what you're looking at here is from the investigative news outlet Ion, Ohio. What they did was they mapped all lands that supported Ohio schools using the data that Dr. Lee just explained, downloaded, and is really a great example of how reporters in one state could provide detailed, localized analysis of the information. Then there was Vox Magazine, which is produced by journalism students at the University of Missouri. And Vox looks specifically at Mizzou's footprint and relationship with the Indigenous communities it receives land from, which is the Osage. So just using some simple timelines, reporters there could add context to the data specifically for Mizzou, and more or less revealing that through miscommunication or deceptive practices, the Osage ceded all of their land to the federal government and were forced to move to Oklahoma, making that land available to the University of Missouri. And then finally, we saw there are stories that really go beyond the data that we collected that instead really utilize Dr. Lee's methodology here. So Scallywag Magazine did this story revealing that Southern universities funded their early years through the sale of land expropriated from Indigenous communities. And the University of North Carolina, of which you can see on this map, they found took more than 200,000 acres of Cherokee and Chickasaw lands that were gained through indigenous removal. And they also found that more than 30% of UNC's annual budget was comprised of land sales between 1818 and 1840, so well before the Morrill Act became law. So these are some of the ways in which we've seen other folks play with the information. Then we've seen action at a number of universities. Bobby, do you want to take that?
Sorry, I was just muted there for a second. Yeah, we've seen a number of actions. I'll just go through this quickly so we can have time for questions. Shortly after we published the story, this was a student senate resolution at the University of Florida, at other places like Yale University, Cornell University. Student governments and advocacy groups started demanding investigations, protested for racial justice, petitioning for increased recruitment and funding for students from tribal nations who had been disadvantaged by the Morrill Act. We really saw this emerge sort of from the ground up. If we go to the next slide here, there were changes in some land acknowledgement practices, though these haven't been as extensive, I would say, as we would have liked to have seen. But Washington State University incorporated some of the land grab view data into an updated land acknowledgement statement that acknowledged that universities are land grant universities are not just built on indigenous land, they're built with indigenous land, and this data can enable you to see that. If we go to the next slide, we have initiatives at places like the University of California, Ohio State, who have started to organize, Cornell University as well, as you see here, started to organize projects, conferences, to really start looking in and digging into this history. This is a Stepping Out and Stepping Up initiative at Ohio State, launched last year in collaboration with the First Nations Development Institute. Some really exciting movement at some land grant universities. We're still in the, I would say, development stage of responding to this issue. We can talk about this a little bit more. I see some of the questions appearing in the chat here. But yeah, as I said earlier, it's a very exciting time to be thinking about this issue and taking it on in ways in which hadn't been on the agenda 5 or 6 years ago. So maybe we could talk about some of those things in the Q&A. But thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you both again so much for sharing and the work that you've been doing, right? I think it's just you see there's comments in the chat that are shared that that they're appreciative and thankful for the efforts that you all have put together with the folks that you've been working with. So thank you. One of the questions that I do see here is, have there been efforts to provide reparations or return land or compensate indigenous peoples for this land? How are these institutions being held accountable? Yeah.
I guess we could start maybe with in terms of reparations or land returns. There, at the moment, I mean, Bobby, correct me if I'm wrong, none of that has happened at the moment. Ohio State is probably the closest to getting to arriving at any sort of reparation plan. As I believe it's basically the only university that's had administration buy-in to actually come up with a plan of reconciliation, as well as working with local tribes and leaders to come up with something that really fits for Ohio. Bobby also mentioned University of California, the conference that happened there. You know, it was one of the first to really dig into this reporting in a way that looked toward land returns, in which I think they spent a good portion of the day really talking about ways in which that could work for universities to do. But short answer, there are no reparations or compensation at the moment. Well, most of the sort of movement we've seen has come from students, staff, and faculty. Again, Ohio, I think, is the only one that administration is on board with it. Nowhere else, unless that's changed, Bobby, since we last spoke.
No. I mean, there was before the story, and we highlight this in the Land Grab University's report. There's South Dakota State University, but this isn't a reparations or land return. This is redirection of continuing funds to be generated from the Morrill Act lands. There are places, generally Western states like South Dakota, that have significant income. I mean, because it comes out of leasing programs for states that sort of held on to this land. And South Dakota State had funneled that into programs for Indigenous students. I'm hearing sort of some rumbling in the background of places where they're thinking about doing something similar, but it could be on different scales. But really, currently, we're in the discussion stage. We're in the stage that we are having the talks like we're doing right now, where people are still sort of coming to grips with this issue. I heard through the grapevine that one of the people running for a seat on the board of trustees at Cornell raised this as sort of a campaign issue. I mean, obliquely, thinking about the university's past. So there are baby steps at places, but not a whole lot of material behind it. I do see one other question here that I would like to answer. I know there are others because I haven't seen this one before, and I think it's a good one and an important one. It's who is funding this research? The Land Grab Universities project was done through High Country News. Tristan knows a little bit more about the scope of the funding. But the thing that I want to emphasize is that a project like this one, it doesn't have to have a huge budget. And I think compared to other, what you would think of as sort of digital humanities projects or data journalism projects, you can do high impact work on a shoestring, which I think is maybe what we did.
Yeah, I mean, I think our total budget for this project was around like $45,000 to $50,000 or so. But it's also important to remember that like almost 20 of that went to the development of the website, because it costs a lot of money to do a website like we showed you. So yeah, I mean, it can be done on a shoestring. Obviously, we prefer not to. We really try to compensate everybody for their work and time. Yeah, I'd say that was probably about the budget to sort of build out everything that you see from the magazine article to the website. I would also actually add, I just remember this too, in terms of action being taken, the only other place that I've heard of right now is University of Minnesota. And University made tuition free to all Native students. I've been told that some of that has to do with our reporting, but I haven't confirmed that. So unfortunately, we can't take any credit for it at the moment. But the word on the street is it had something to do with it. But that is actually one of the sort of like common denominators we've seen at every institution, is that Indigenous students should receive free tuition based on this reporting. And that is something that is like completely across the board at every institution that we've talked to, we're seeing action at.
And then there's two more questions that I'm just going to put them out there and you answer them as you would like. One is around how have other Indigenous folks or tribes or nations, right, how have they responded to your research? And then there's a question about are you doing donations or crowdfunding, and how could folks kind of contribute to support the work?
I mean, I guess I could start with tribal response. I mean, we've seen a pretty massive response from academics, especially Indigenous academics looking at this work. Official responses from tribal nations, not as many. But I think the thing that is probably important to remember is that I'm not sure it's I'm not sure it's on the nations to come out and have something to say here. It's probably more on the universities to reach out on the other end and say, hey, we did this thing, we should talk about it. So that's probably something to sort of keep in mind there. But in terms of like donations or crowdfunding, no, we aren't doing that. I think one of the things, I don't know, what I'd like to see is a lot more research and reporting around this. As Bobby said, there is so much that folks can do with this data. And there's so, you can go really, really deep with this stuff. And really it just takes, in terms of having an open source project, the idea is that like your eyes can see things that ours can't when you're looking at the information. And I think that's really the most important thing about these kind of projects, is that we were able to see only what we could see. But the data has been used by other folks for all kinds of stuff that we just never thought about.
Yeah, I would just also add to that. I mean, we were looking at it from like the 30,000 feet down level. We were trying to come to terms with the enormity of the entire problem and the entire extent of the land that was redistributed in this way. So our maps are like mostly at the continental scale, and we touched down a few places, but as Tristan said, there's possibilities to touch down on every one of these parcels. We know very, very little about the long-term administration and consequences of these grants. At land-grant universities, at places like Iowa State, you all listening there who are in Iowa are in a position to, as researchers yourselves, or to take students to organize seminars around going into your university archives, going into your state archives, and putting the details onto this larger story, and focusing in and being able to understand how this played out for Iowa State. That's the types of stories that are waiting to be told, and that's why I highlighted the Iowa Legacy Project. I mean, they were already thinking in this direction. I mean, the project did not consider the indigenous origins of this land at all, but what it did very well, I thought, was reach out to current occupants of these parcels and see what their story is. What you could do by combining that type of work with the type of work we've done is to connect the stories of occupants of these parcels now to the deeper histories of dispossession and wealth redistribution that enabled the growth of a place like the state of Iowa, the development of a university like Iowa State. There are real possibilities to dig in ways that we were just not able to, even working on this for years at the scale that we were addressing it at.
I mean, and I guess I would just add to it again is that this is Dr. Lee's brainchild here in coming up with this like methodology and how this investigation like occurred. And I'm seeing even in the comments here that like Iowa State owns over 15,000 acres of land. A lot of that acreage, all of that acreage is not Morrill Act land, because Iowa was not one of the states that held on to Morrill Act parcels. So if you apply the same like thinking here of, where those 15,000 acres are, and you apply that level of treaty lands that we've provided through the data, you've got a complete new story there about whose land it is and how Iowa State got it, right? So like it's not just this story, it's a methodology that can be used for almost anything that you want to, if you want to put the time into it. And yeah, 15,000 acres. Yeah, where is it? What's it being used for? What account is that Morrill Act money in, for instance? What is the interest that's being raised on it? Could that go to Native students, for instance? Could those parcels of land that Iowa State still owns right now, could they be given back to the tribes? I mean, these are all very real questions that you can solve and answer. Well, maybe not solve, but you can answer and come up with ways to deal with those. And again, I think it just it's really digging in and taking interest in what this history is and those debts.
Thank you. Now, I think we're at the close, right? Because give me a time check, April and Casey. We're within an hour, right? Okay. Well, I know there's a couple different good questions that are within this space, but I think there's a lot of space for us to do some of that work, right? And I think that's a lot of what you all shared with us today, right? You've done some great stuff to start out for us, but there's some work for us to do and answering some and getting into some of these different questions and figuring some things out for ourselves. And so if we could, again, maybe in the chat or somehow that we're able to give a good, warm, thank you, round of applause, sign of appreciation, gesture of appreciation for our two guests. And then also, I mean, just for myself, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my ELAT, who was working to help bring to you. And thanks and shout out to the ISCORE folks helping make this happen for us as well too. So we appreciate you all's time, the gifts and the value of your labor, right? But also just thank you for you just being you and taking up this project and doing the things that you do. So much love and appreciate you. I'm not sure who I'm supposed to pass it to, but thank y'all.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Hey. Again, thank you for sharing your research and participating in our small effort here in Iowa and regarding having a platform for discussion and potential opportunity for improvement. At this point in time, I'm, I guess, providing closing remarks, and we're at the halfway point. What I would do is really talk a little bit about a recap of the day. There were quite a few sessions, conversations, sidebars, I guess from the comfort of your homes or your offices, but in a virtual space. And I still think that we are making progress. ISCORE is Friday. A number of you have registered for the in-person experience. As we said, lunch is restricted to 400, and you sign up for a lunch ticket. You can pick it up between 8:30 and 12:30. After that, we will release tickets. There's enough food. It's just a matter of spacing. So at this point in time, I'll give you back your day and thank you for your participation. This concludes the pre-conference for ISCORE 22. Thank you.